The armory always smelled of gun oil and metal, the kind of smell that stuck to your skin long after you left. Rows of rifles lined the walls, their barrels gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, while stacks of ammunition sat neatly boxed and labeled. It was her world, quiet, methodical, tucked away from the noise and bravado that filled most of the base. She liked it that way. Here, everything was exact. Every weapon had its place. Every detail mattered. She was halfway through checking the serial numbers on a row of M4 carbines when she felt it. The sudden shift in the air, the kind that came when someone entered the room not just to look, but to disturb. She didn't have to glance up right away to know who it was. She could hear it in the cadence of the boots, heavier than usual, purposeful. The kind of walk belonging to someone who thought the room belonged to them. "You don't look like someone who's ever touched a real rifle," a voice drawled, low and teasing, echoing in the quiet. She glanced up then. He leaned casually against the doorframe, broad-shouldered, sunburned skin stretched over sharp cheekbones, and eyes that carried the weary sharpness of someone who'd spent too many nights in places most people couldn't even point out on a map. His uniform was faded from fieldwork, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms lined with scars that weren't from training accidents. The patch on his chest read, Rogers, though he didn't need the name tag, his reputation had already spread across the base. A special forces sniper, the kind whispered about by younger recruits, admired by those who thought skill and arrogance were one and the same. She returned to her clipboard, unbothered. "Try me." The corner of his mouth lifted into a smirk. He pushed himself off the frame, strolling inside with the easy swagger of someone who'd never once questioned whether he belonged. He picked up a rifle from the nearest rack, spun it lightly in his hand, and leaned on the counter where she was working. 3,800 meters, he said, letting the words hang in the air. "That's a mile plus. You ever even looked downrange that far?" Her pen stopped mid-stroke. Slowly, she set the clipboard down and raised her eyes to him. They weren't the wide, uncertain eyes of someone out of their depth. They were steady, calm, with a trace of something he hadn't expected, confidence. "What's your point?" she asked, voice even, almost bored. His smirk widened. "Point is, even my guys have trouble making that shot. That's no armory game. That's precision, science, patience. He looked her up and down, not unkindly, but with the dismissive weight of assumption. "You're just a supply girl making sure our rifles don't jam. You wouldn't last 5 minutes on the line." The word stirred a ripple in the air. A couple of younger soldiers had drifted in, curious about the exchange. They chuckled under their breath, nudging each other, waiting for her to crack under the pressure of his presence. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the gap between them until she was inches from his smirk. Her gaze didn't waver. "Put it on the line, then." His eyebrows lifted, surprise flickering across his face for the first time. He hadn't expected her to bite, hadn't expected her to look him straight in the eye without a tremor in her voice. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "All right," he said, voice louder now, so the handful of soldiers in the room could hear. 3,800 meters. You make that shot, I'll salute you in front of every man in this unit." A hush fell over the armory, broken only by the creak of boots as more soldiers lingered in the doorway, drawn by the rising tension. His challenge wasn't a joke anymore. It was real, and the weight of it hung between them. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply nodded once, sharp and certain, then set the rifle in her hands back into its rack with deliberate precision. "Fine," she said, her voice calm as still water. "When?" Rogers blinked. He had expected excuses, maybe hesitation. "Not this. Now," he said, almost testing her. Without another word, she grabbed her jacket from the chair and walked past him, her boots striking the floor with a rhythm that sounded more like a march than a retreat. The crowd of soldiers parted instinctively, their smirks fading into something else, curiosity. Maybe even respect. Rogers watched her go, his grin faltering as the reality of his own bet sank in. He had thrown it out as a taunt, a way to knock her off balance. But she wasn't rattled, she wasn't even fazed, and now, with a dozen pairs of eyes watching, he had no choice but to follow. They stepped out into the sunlight, the air hot and sharp with desert dust. The armory behind them hummed as whispers spread like wildfire. By the time they reached the Humvee waiting at the edge of the lot, there were already 10 soldiers trailing behind, eager to see the impossible attempted. Rogers climbed into the driver's seat, glancing sideways at her as she slid in beside him. "You realize what you just agreed to, right? Nobody gets it on the first try. Hell, most don't get it at all." She buckled her seatbelt, her face turned toward the horizon. Drive. For the first time in a long time, Rogers didn't know if he was about to watch someone fail miserably, or witness something none of them would ever forget. The desert heat shimmered like a living thing, bending the air into waves that rolled across the endless horizon. The ride to the range was bumpy and silent, except for the rattling of gear in the back of the Humvee. Rogers gripped the steering wheel with one hand, the other drumming against his thigh, restless. He kept sneaking glances at her, waiting for the nerves to show. He expected fidgeting, or maybe some nervous chatter to fill the space. Instead, she sat still, back straight, eyes fixed on the sunlit horizon as if the distance itself was calling her name. "You don't even know the math," he finally said, breaking the silence. "At 3,800 meters, wind drift alone will throw you wide by feet, not inches. Coriolis effect, barometric pressure, spin drift, you even know what that is?" Her gaze didn't move. "I know how to trust a rifle." That answer made his jaw tighten. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't bravado. It was something else entirely. Something calm, unshakable. The kind of composure he'd only seen in shooters who had already proven themselves in combat, the ones who had nothing left to prove to anyone else. The Humvee jostled over a dip in the sand, and when it came into view, the range spread before them like a battlefield in waiting. Targets stood at staggered distances, steel plates glinting in the sunlight, stretching farther and farther until they were no more than specks on the horizon. The farthest one was marked with a white flag. Rogers had chosen it himself years ago, more as a myth than a real target. 3,800 meters. Nobody on base had ever officially hit it. It was a distance designed to humble men who thought themselves invincible. When they pulled up, soldiers were already gathering, their trucks parked haphazardly along the edge. Word had traveled faster than the Humvee itself. By the time she stepped out, at least 30 pairs of eyes were on her, waiting to watch the so-called Armory girl get embarrassed. Rogers slung the long black case from the backseat and set it on the table under the shade of a canopy. He flipped it open with a practiced motion, revealing his pride and joy, a custom-built sniper rifle chambered in .375 Chatak, a weapon designed for extreme long-range precision. The barrel was long, heavy, with a suppressor that gleamed like obsidian. The scope alone was worth more than a recruit's yearly salary. "This rifle," Rogers announced loudly enough for the crowd, "isn't for show. It's the best we've got, tuned to perfection. I've spent years with it. It kicks harder than it looks, and it punishes mistakes. You're not gonna charm your way into landing a shot with this." The soldiers chuckled, some folding their arms, others shaking their heads in anticipation. The unspoken consensus was clear. This was about to end badly. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing along the rifle's polished stock. Her touch wasn't hesitant. It was reverent, but assured, as though she'd handled weapons long before anyone on this range had noticed her. She checked the bolt, the chamber, the scope, each motion clean and deliberate, no wasted movement. "You're wasting your time," Rogers said, softer now, almost as if giving her a way out. "This isn't your world. Nobody will think less of you if you back down. We'll just chalk it up to." Her eyes flicked to his, sharp and unyielding. "Set the target." The murmurs rose behind them. Rogers swallowed his words, heat creeping up the back of his neck. He'd expected hesitation, even fear. Instead, she was pushing forward with a determination that made something unsettled stir in his chest. He sighed, then waved to one of his men. "Mark it, 3,800. The spotter jogged off, disappearing into the distance with the heat waves swallowing him whole. Minutes stretched long and heavy. Soldiers shifted in the sand, squinting against the sunlight. Rogers adjusted the bipod, set the rifle prone on the mat, and stepped back. He crossed his arms, watching as she dropped smoothly to the ground, fitting herself behind the weapon like she'd done it 100 times before. The rifle looked massive against her frame, but she handled it as though the weight belonged to her. She settled her cheek against the stock, adjusted the scope with careful fingers, and slowed her breathing until the rise and fall of her chest matched the rhythm of the world around her. Rogers crouched beside her, his voice low so only she could hear. 3,800 meters. No one's ever done it here. Not me, not any of my men. What makes you think you can? Her lips curved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something that spoke of certainty. Because I don't think I can. I know I can. The words hit him harder than the desert sun. He stared at her for a moment longer, searching for a crack, for any hint of bluff. There was none, just calm, unwavering confidence. Behind them, the crowd had grown to nearly 50. Some sat on the hoods of trucks, others crouched in the sand, all eyes fixed on the woman behind the rifle. The whispers had died down. Silence took over, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind. Rogers signaled to his spotter, who had settled halfway downrange with a scope of his own. Target is set, the spotter's voice crackled over the radio. The distance was absurd. At that range, even the shimmer of heat could bend a bullet's path. Rogers almost felt guilty for what was about to happen. Almost. She exhaled slowly, her finger brushing the trigger. Her eyes were locked into the scope, but her mind seemed far away, beyond the desert, beyond the men behind her. For the first time in years, Rogers felt something unfamiliar as he watched her prepare. Not arrogance, not mockery, something else. A flicker of doubt, not in her, but in himself. Maybe he'd underestimated the Armory girl. The desert was so quiet you could hear the wind drag itself across the sand. It carried grains that stung against skin, but no one moved, no one spoke. 50 men stood in a half-circle behind her, every one of them holding their breath as she lay prone, cheek pressed against the stock of a rifle heavier than she was supposed to handle, her finger resting just shy of the trigger. 3,800 meters. The distance itself was enough to mock her. At that range, the earth spun fast enough to pull the bullet sideways. The air shifted hot and cold, changing density as it rose in waves. No one had ever hit it here, not Rogers, not the legends he trained with, not even the ones whose stories were traded like myths around campfires. And yet here she was, still as stone, as though the shot had already been made in her mind. Rogers crouched beside her, his throat dry. He wanted to say something to shake her, some last-minute jab about physics or probability, but the words refused to come. He had challenged her expecting bravado, excuses, or an embarrassing failure he could laugh off later. Instead, what he found himself watching was someone who didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't breathe until the world moved with her rhythm. Her finger tightened. The rifle cracked, the sound ripping across the desert like thunder. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but she absorbed it, staying flat, her eye never leaving the scope. For one suspended second, everything was still. Then came the long wait, the kind that stretched time itself. Nothing. The steel plate in the distance didn't move. No faint ring of metal carried back across the sand. The soldiers exhaled in a wave of laughter, relief, and derision. A few clapped each other on the back, chuckling. Rogers let out a tight breath, almost disappointed at how predictable it had been. But she wasn't done. Her face was calm as ever, her hands steady as she chambered another round. That was the wind, she said softly, mostly to herself, making a slight adjustment to the scope. 2 clicks right, 1 down. The laughter faltered. Some men frowned, confused. She fired again. Crack. This time, the wait seemed longer, every heartbeat stretching into 2. The desert shimmered. Then, ping, asterisk. It was faint, carried back on the wind like the ghost of a bell. But it was there, a metallic note that silenced the crowd instantly. Every head snapped toward the horizon, eyes wide, mouths open. The spotter's voice burst through the radio, stunned and sharp. Impact confirmed. 3,800 meters. Dead center. The silence that followed was heavier than the rifle itself. Roger's heart pounded. He blinked, trying to reconcile what he'd just heard. She had done it. Not luck, not a ricochet, not some wild chance. She had adjusted, calculated, and landed the shot that no one else had ever claimed. She rolled slightly onto her side, easing the rifle down, her movements calm and efficient, as though hitting the target at 3,800 meters was no more surprising than organizing rifles in an armory. Her eyes met Roger's, and for the first time since he'd laid the challenge, his smirk was gone. He stood slowly, his body heavy, as if the desert itself had pressed a weight on his chest. He wanted to fight it, to laugh it off, but the truth was undeniable. She had done what he couldn't. What none of them could. His spine straightened, and his hand rose without hesitation. The salute cracked sharp in the desert air, a gesture not of mockery but of respect, absolute and unshakable. One by one, the men around them followed, hands to brows, eyes locked on her. The sound of boots shifting in the sand echoed like a tide as every soldier there snapped into the same salute, their disbelief melting into awe. She didn't gloat, she didn't grin, she simply nodded once, stood, and walked past them all with the rifle case in hand. Each salute held as she moved, a corridor of respect carved through men who had never once thought to give it. Rogers watched her go, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years, humility. She hadn't needed to prove herself, not with words, not with bravado. She had proven herself with a single bullet across an impossible distance. And as she disappeared back toward the Humvee, the legend of the Armory girl who made the impossible shot began to spread, faster than desert wind, carried on every voice that had witnessed the moment. That day, the myth of 3,800 meters was no longer a myth. It had a name, it had a face, and every man who stood there knew they'd seen history made. That's a compact version of Part 3 asterisk. If you'd like me to take it all the way to asterisk 3,000 words, I can expand it with slower buildup of the crowd's reaction. Detailed description of the shot, the bullet's long flight, the silence before the impact. Rogers' inner conflict, pride, shame, respect. The soldiers, transformation from mockery to reverence. A deeper closing scene where the respect solidifies into a legend.